My wife transferred our life savings to her boyfriend's account while I was at my father's funeral, not knowing I'd been 3 steps ahead for months. Welcome to Revenge Galore. If you crave real gripping stories, where justice hits hard and betrayal never goes unpunished, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and join us for your daily dose of raw, emotional, and unforgettable justice. My name is Gabriel Thornfield and I'm 42 years old. For the past 15 years, I've been a senior partner at Meridian Engineering, specializing in sustainable infrastructure projects across the Southeast. I thought I knew everything about building foundations that could withstand any storm. What I didn't expect was that the greatest test of my engineering skills would come from dismantling the elaborate scheme my wife had constructed to destroy our life together. The text message arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in October, while I was sitting in my father's hospital room in Charlotte. He'd been fighting pancreatic cancer for 8 months, and the doctors had just told us we were looking at days, not weeks. I was holding his hand, watching his labored breathing when my phone buzzed. Emergency transfer completed. New account secure. Can't wait to start our real life together. The message was from my wife, Victoria, but it wasn't meant for me. It was supposed to go to someone else, someone who was apparently waiting to start a real life with my wife of 13 years. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then set the phone aside and continued holding my father's hand. He taught me that the most important decisions are made when your emotions are screaming the loudest, but your mind stays quiet. This was one of those moments. Dad passed away 2 days later, on a Thursday morning with autumn sunlight streaming through the hospital windows. Victoria arrived just as the nurses were removing the monitors, dressed in black as if she'd planned for this moment. She hugged me, whispered the right words, played the grieving daughter-in-law perfectly. "I'm so sorry, Gabriel. He was such a good man. We'll get through this together." I nodded and let her comfort me, all while knowing she'd stolen $340,000 from our joint accounts while I'd been watching my father die. The inheritance from Dad was substantial. $1.2 million from the sale of his construction company, plus another $800,000 in investments in life insurance. But more than the money, it represented everything he built from nothing. A kid from rural North Carolina who'd started with a pickup truck and a toolbox, eventually employing over 200 people and building half the schools in 3 counties. "Build something that lasts, son," he told me during our last real conversation. "Money comes and goes, but what you create with integrity, that's your real legacy." I'd inherited his methodical nature along with his money. When something felt wrong, I investigated. When I found problems, I fixed them systematically. And for the past 6 months, everything about Victoria had felt wrong. The signs started small. Phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. New passwords on devices that had never been locked before. Weekend yoga retreats that she couldn't describe in any detail. Credit card charges from restaurants I'd never been to, hotels and cities she'd never mentioned visiting. Then came the questions about my finances. Casual at first, where did I keep investment statements, which accounts auto-paid which bills, whether I'd ever considered consolidating everything for simplicity. Victoria had never shown interest in our financial details before. She ran her interior design business, I handled the engineering contracts, and we'd split household responsibilities based on our strengths. But suddenly she wanted to understand everything. How much was in each account, what the access requirements were, which advisor managed what portfolio. She even suggested we should have joint access to everything, in case something happened to one of us. I'd nodded thoughtfully and promised to look into it. Instead, I'd called Harrison Blackwell, my father's attorney for 20 years and now mine. "Something's not right, Harrison," I told him during a meeting in August. "Victoria's asking questions she's never cared about before, and her behavior has changed completely." Harrison had leaned back in his leather chair, studying me with the same careful attention he'd given my father's business deals. "What kind of questions?" I'd outlined Victoria's sudden financial curiosity, her new travel patterns, the way she'd started treating our home like a hotel she was staying in temporarily. "Gabriel, your father was very specific about protecting your inheritance. He suggested we structure it as an irrevocable trust with specific access requirements. Do you remember why?" I did remember. Dad had seen too many of his friends lose everything in divorces, watched successful men get taken advantage of by people who saw dollar signs instead of relationships. He said people show their true nature when money's involved. Exactly. And he wanted to make sure that if anyone tried to access your inheritance improperly, you'd know about it immediately. That's when Harrison explained the monitoring systems Dad had insisted on. Every account access was logged and time-stamped. Any attempt to transfer funds triggered automatic alerts. The trust structure meant that even with my personal information, Victoria couldn't move money without passing identity verification that included questions only I could answer. Your father was a careful man, Gabriel. If you're sensing problems, trust that instinct. I'd left Harrison's office with a new understanding of my father's wisdom and a growing certainty that Victoria was planning something that would require careful preparation to counter. The private investigator I hired in September was discreet and thorough. Within 2 weeks, Marcus Chen had provided me with a comprehensive picture of my wife's secret life. Victoria had been having an affair for 8 months with Trevor Garrison, a financial advisor she'd met at a networking event in April. Trevor specialized in helping people relocate assets for lifestyle transitions, a euphemism for helping wealthy individuals hide money from spouses, business partners, or tax authorities. The relationship had started as a professional consultation about investment opportunities, but had quickly become personal. Trevor had convinced Victoria that she deserved a more exciting life than what she could have with a boring engineer in Charlotte. He'd shown her properties in Costa Rica, talked about the businesses they could start together, painted a picture of adventure and luxury funded by my inheritance. Marcus's report included photographs from their weekend trips to Asheville and Savannah, records of joint credit cards Victoria had opened without my knowledge, and documentation of a Costa Rican bank account established in her name with Trevor as co-signer. Most damaging was the timeline Marcus had constructed showing how Victoria had systematically researched my financial accounts, attempting to access information she thought she'd need to transfer funds. The monitoring system had captured every failed login attempt, every password reset request, every effort to gather information about accounts she had no legitimate reason to access. She's been planning this for months, Marcus had told me when delivering his final report. This isn't impulsive. It's a coordinated scheme to drain your assets and disappear. I'd studied the evidence with the same analytical approach I brought to engineering problems. Victoria and Trevor had been thorough in their planning but had made critical assumptions about my financial setup that were completely wrong. They'd assumed I kept money in easily accessible accounts. They'd assumed joint accounts meant unrestricted access. They'd assumed I wouldn't notice unauthorized activity until it was too late. What they hadn't anticipated was that my father had spent 40 years in business learning to protect himself from exactly this kind of betrayal. The morning after Dad's funeral, I sat in our kitchen drinking coffee and waiting for Victoria to wake up. She'd been exhausted by the emotional stress of the funeral and had taken a sleeping pill, something she'd never needed before but had been using regularly for the past month. When she finally appeared at 10:30, she looked refreshed rather than grief-stricken. She kissed my cheek and poured herself coffee, chattering about funeral arrangements and thank you cards as if the previous day had been a social event rather than the burial of my father. I was thinking, she said, settling at the breakfast table, maybe we should take a trip. Get away from everything for a while. Process what's happened. Where did you have in mind? Somewhere tropical. Costa Rica, maybe. I've been researching wellness retreats there. I nodded thoughtfully. Sounds nice. Though I should probably handle Dad's financial matters first. The inheritance paperwork is complicated. Victoria's expression sharpened with interest. How complicated? Trusts, tax implications, multiple accounts. Harrison says it could take months to sort through everything. Maybe I could help, she offered. I'm good with details. That's thoughtful. Though most of it requires my personal verification. Dad was paranoid about security. I watched her face as she processed this information. The disappointment was subtle but unmistakable. Well, she said, standing to refill her coffee, let me know if there's anything I can do. That afternoon, while Victoria was at her office, I drove to Harrison's law firm downtown. He'd already reviewed Marcus's investigative report and had prepared a comprehensive response plan. The good news, Harrison said, spreading documents across his conference table, is that your father's protective measures worked perfectly. Victoria has accessed joint accounts, but those contained less than 15% of your total assets. The inheritance and your primary investments are completely protected. The bad news? She's taken $340,000 from joint accounts and transferred it to an account controlled by her affair partner. Technically, she had legal access to those funds, so it's not theft in the criminal sense. But it's definitely grounds for divorce on the basis of financial misconduct. Harrison had prepared divorce papers citing abandonment and financial betrayal. More importantly, he documented every aspect of Victoria's scheme, creating a legal record that would prevent her from claiming ignorance or victimization. There's something else, Harrison continued. The monitoring system captured new activity yesterday. Someone tried to access your trust accounts using your personal information but failed the security verification. The attempts came from a computer in Victoria's office. I studied the access logs Harrison showed me. Multiple login attempts, password reset requests, and queries about account balances, all occurring while I'd been at Dad's funeral. She tried to steal from me while I was burying my father. The timing suggests coordination with someone else, Harrison agreed. The attempts were too sophisticated and persistent for someone acting alone. That evening, Victoria announced she needed to visit her sister in Atlanta for a few days. Sarah's having marriage problems, she explained. She needs someone to talk to. Victoria had never been close to her sister. Sarah had been to our house exactly twice in 13 years of marriage. Of course, I said. Take all the time you need. After she left, I called Marcus Chen. Within 2 hours, he confirmed that Victoria was not driving to Atlanta. Instead, she was meeting Trevor Garrison at a mountain cabin outside Asheville, the same location where they'd spent multiple weekends planning their scheme. I spent the next 3 days preparing. Harrison filed the divorce papers with the court. Marcus gathered additional evidence of the affair and financial planning. My accountant, Patricia Wells, worked with Harrison to document the exact scope of Victoria's unauthorized transactions. Most importantly, I prepared for the conversation that would end our marriage. Victoria returned from her fake sister visit on Saturday afternoon, relaxed and happy in a way I hadn't seen her in months. She unpacked her bags, showed me the gifts Sarah had supposedly sent, and suggested we go out for dinner to celebrate getting through the difficult week. Actually, I said, I was hoping we could stay in tonight. I have something important to discuss. We ordered takeout and sat in our living room, the space Victoria had designed with such care when we'd bought the house 8 years earlier. Looking around at the furniture and artwork she'd chosen, I felt sad for what we'd lost, but also relief that the deception was finally ending. Victoria, I began, I know about Trevor. The change in her expression was immediate and complete. The relaxed happiness vanished, replaced by defensive calculation. I don't know what you mean. I pulled out my phone and showed her the misdirected text message. This was meant for him, not me. She stared at the screen for a long moment, then set down her wine glass with shaking hands. Gabriel, I can explain. I know about the Costa Rican bank account. I know about the weekend trips. I know about the $340,000 you transferred while I was at my father's funeral. Victoria's face went pale. How could you possibly? I know about the attempts to access my trust accounts. I know about the business plan you and Trevor developed. I know about the property you've been looking at in Manuel Antonio. I'd pulled out Marcus's investigative file and spread the photographs and documents across our coffee table. Bank statements, hotel receipts, property listings, email transcripts, everything that documented 8 months of systematic betrayal. Victoria stared at the evidence, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. This isn't what it looks like, she finally said. What does it look like to you? I was going to tell you. I just needed time to figure out how. You were going to tell me about stealing money while I was burying my father? She flinched. I wasn't stealing. We're married. It's community property. The joint accounts, yes. But you also tried to access trust funds that are legally protected. That's attempted fraud, Victoria. I showed her the access logs Harrison had prepared. Timestamps, IP addresses, failed verification attempts, all occurring while she knew I was dealing with my father's death. Trevor said those accounts were just savings, she whispered. He said married couples should have access to everything. Trevor was wrong. And now he's implicated in conspiracy to commit financial fraud. Victoria looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before, pure fear. What do you want? She asked. I want you to understand what's going to happen next. I handed her a copy of the divorce papers Harrison had filed. She read through them slowly, her face becoming more ashen with each page. You're divorcing me? You divorced us when you decided to steal my father's legacy to fund a new life with another man. Gabriel, please. We can work this out. I made a mistake, but I love you. Trevor doesn't mean anything. Victoria, you spent 8 months planning to destroy our marriage. You researched how to steal money that represents everything my father worked for. You tried to access protected accounts while I was grieving. This wasn't a mistake, it was a campaign. She tried several more approaches, tears, anger, bargaining, threats. But I'd spent months preparing for this conversation, and I'd learned from watching my father handle difficult negotiations that emotional manipulation only works if you allow it to. Here's what's going to happen. I said when she finally stopped talking. You're going to move out of this house. You're going to return the money you transferred to Trevor's account. And you're going to accept the settlement terms Harrison has prepared. What if I refuse? Then I'll pursue criminal charges for attempted fraud. Trevor will face conspiracy charges. The evidence will become public record, which means everyone in your professional network will know exactly what you tried to do. Victoria stared at me for a long moment. You're not the man I married, she said finally. You're right. The man you married trusted you completely. He would have given you anything you asked for. He would have supported any decision you made about our future. But that man doesn't exist anymore. So what happens now? Now you pack a bag and stay somewhere else tonight. Tomorrow you start returning the money and accepting the consequences of your choices. Victoria left that evening with 2 suitcases and a look of stunned disbelief. I think she genuinely believed that her affair and theft would go unnoticed, or that I would be too devastated by my father's death to respond effectively. What she hadn't understood was that my father had spent his entire life preparing me for exactly this moment, not the specific betrayal, but the principle of protecting what matters and responding to threats with careful preparation rather than emotional reaction. The next morning Harrison called with an update. Victoria's hired Sandra Phillips to represent her, he said. Phillips called this morning wanting to negotiate. Sandra Phillips had a reputation as an aggressive divorce attorney who specialized in maximizing settlements for spouses claiming financial disadvantage. What did you tell her? I sent over our evidence file. Phillips called back an hour later with a very different tone. Victoria's in serious legal jeopardy, and Phillips knows it. The evidence against Victoria was overwhelming. The timeline Marcus had constructed showed months of deliberate planning. The access logs proved she'd attempted unauthorized entry into protected accounts. The relationship with Trevor provided clear motive for the financial misconduct. Most damaging was Victoria's own documentation. She'd kept detailed notes about my financial accounts, including hand-drawn diagrams of what she thought was my asset structure. She'd researched transfer procedures, foreign banking requirements, and methods for moving money without triggering reporting requirements. She basically created a roadmap for financial fraud, Harrison explained. If this goes to trial, she'll face criminal charges in addition to the divorce proceedings. Phillips requested a settlement conference for the following week. When we met in Harrison's office, Victoria looked like she'd aged years in the span of days. She sat next to Phillips, avoiding eye contact while Harrison presented our terms. Victoria would return $300,000 of the stolen funds within 30 days. She would relinquish all claims to our marital home, my inheritance and my business assets. She would sign a non-disclosure agreement preventing her from discussing our marriage or divorce. In exchange, I would not pursue criminal charges related to the attempted fraud. These terms are extremely punitive, Phillips objected. My client is entitled to equitable distribution of marital assets. Your client forfeited those rights when she attempted to steal protected inheritance funds, Harrison replied. The evidence supports criminal charges that would result in felony convictions. My client is being generous by offering a settlement. Phillips requested a recess to consult with Victoria privately. When they returned, Victoria had clearly been crying. My client accepts the terms, Phillips announced. All of them? Harrison asked. All of them. Victoria signed the settlement agreement without saying a word. As she prepared to leave, she finally looked at me directly. I never meant for it to happen this way, she said. But you did mean for it to happen. That's what makes all the difference. The money Victoria returned came from closing the Costa Rican account Trevor had helped her establish. Trevor himself disappeared shortly after Victoria's arrest became inevitable, leaving her to face the consequences alone. His financial advisory license was revoked, and his previous clients began discovering similar patterns of misconduct. The house sale went smoothly. Victoria had put considerable work into making it beautiful, and the interior design she'd done attracted multiple offers. I used the proceeds to buy a smaller place closer to downtown, a restored 1920s bungalow that needed the kind of hands-on work my father had taught me to appreciate. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I received a letter from the State Bar Association. Trevor had been arrested in Miami trying to flee to the Cayman Islands with money stolen from 3 other clients. The investigation into his financial schemes had revealed the full scope of his relationship with Victoria, including evidence that he'd specifically targeted her because of my inheritance. Your ex-wife was a victim as much as a perpetrator, the prosecutor explained during a phone call. Garrison had a pattern of identifying wealthy married women and convincing them to steal from their spouses. Victoria wasn't his first target, and she wouldn't have been his last. I felt some sympathy for Victoria. She'd been manipulated by someone far more sophisticated than she was. But sympathy didn't erase the fact that she'd chosen betrayal over honesty, theft over communication, deception over trust. The engineering firm I'd built with my father's guidance continued to thrive. The sustainable infrastructure projects we specialized in were in increasing demand, and I found that the analytical skills that had helped me navigate Victoria's betrayal also made me a better business leader. A year after the divorce, I established the Robert Thornfield Foundation using a portion of Dad's inheritance. The foundation provided scholarships for first-generation college students studying engineering, with a focus on kids from working-class families like Dad's. "Your father would be proud," Harrison told me during the foundation's first scholarship ceremony. "You've honored his legacy in exactly the way he hoped you would." I thought about Dad often during that first year alone. His voice in my head whenever I faced difficult decisions, his example of building something meaningful through consistent effort over time. The inheritance he'd left wasn't just money, it was a framework for living with integrity even when others chose not to. Victoria sent me one letter, 6 months after our divorce was final. She was working as a sales associate at a furniture store in Columbia, South Carolina, living in a small apartment, trying to rebuild her professional reputation after the scandal that had ended her design business. "I know you'll never forgive me," she wrote, "but I want you to know that I understand what I lost. Not just the money or the house but the life we could have had together. Trevor made me believe that what we had wasn't enough, that I deserved more excitement and luxury. I realize now that what we had was worth more than anything he promised." She was right, I couldn't forgive her. Not because of the money, but because of the choice she'd made to destroy our marriage rather than simply ending it honestly. If she'd wanted a different life, I would have helped her achieve it. If she'd wanted a divorce, I would have made it as easy as possible. But she'd chosen deception, theft, and betrayal instead of conversation. That choice revealed something about her character that couldn't be explained away by Trevor's manipulation. 2 years after the divorce, I met Sarah Chin at a sustainable building conference in Atlanta. She was a renewable energy consultant who shared my interest in projects that could make meaningful environmental impact. We started collaborating professionally, then personally, building a relationship based on shared values rather than convenience or circumstance. Sarah knew about Victoria and the divorce. The story had been covered in local business publications as an example of financial fraud in domestic relationships. But she also saw how I'd used the experience to build stronger personal and professional foundations. "You could have become bitter," she told me one evening as we reviewed plans for a solar array project we were developing together. "Instead, you became more intentional about everything you build." She was right. The betrayal had taught me to distinguish between relationships based on genuine compatibility and those based on circumstantial convenience. It had shown me the importance of protecting what matters while remaining open to building something new. 3 years after Dad's death, I received a call from Victoria's sister Sarah, the one Victoria had supposedly been visiting during her planning trip with Trevor. "I thought you should know," Sarah said, "Victoria's getting married again. Some guy she met at the furniture store where she works." I thanked her for the information and hung up, feeling neither anger nor satisfaction. Victoria was building a new life on a foundation I hoped was more honest than the one she tried to build with my inheritance. The foundation Dad's money had established was supporting its 15th scholarship recipient by then. Kids from small towns across North Carolina and South Carolina, studying engineering and planning to build infrastructure that would serve their communities for generations. Standing in my workshop on a Saturday afternoon, refinishing a dining table Sarah and I had bought at an estate sale, I thought about the different kinds of legacies people leave behind. Victoria had tried to steal money to fund a fantasy life that collapsed as soon as it was tested. Trevor had built a career on manipulation and theft that ultimately destroyed him. But Dad had built something that would keep growing long after his death. Not just the money but the principles that guided how it was used. Build something that lasts. Protect what matters. Respond to challenges with preparation, not panic. The table I was working on had been built in 1942 by a craftsman who'd probably never imagined it would still be serving families 8 decades later. That's the kind of legacy worth creating, not flashy or dramatic but solid enough to endure whatever storms might come. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Still coming to dinner tonight? I'm making that pasta dish you like." I looked around the workshop Dad had taught me to appreciate, at the home I'd built from the ruins of a marriage I'd thought would last forever, at the life I'd constructed on principles he'd spent 40 years teaching me. On my way, I texted back and started cleaning up my tools. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying the people who've wronged you. Sometimes it's simply building something better than what they tried to tear down, and doing it so well that their betrayal becomes irrelevant to your story. Victoria had tried to steal my father's legacy. Instead, she taught me how to honor it in ways I might never have discovered otherwise. For that lesson, if nothing else, I was grateful. Have you ever had someone try to take advantage of your trust during a vulnerable moment? How do you balance protecting yourself financially while staying open to genuine relationships? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of strategic justice and financial vindication, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Revenge Galore for more stories where preparation triumphs over betrayal and integrity ultimately wins. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest tales of justice served cold.